to mute during the presentation, so we don't have any interruptions. And we're gonna go for an hour, then we'll take a break, and then we'll have discussion, okay? Okay, Dr. Grace Slayer comes to us from the Holmes Institute, which offers quality distance education graduate programs and consciousness studies to spiritual leaders preparing for service in the global community. He is the Chief Academic Officer at the Holmes Institute, where he directs a master's degree program in wisdom studies. Dr. Slayer received his doctorate in interdisciplinary studies from Emory University and has been an administrator and scholar in higher education institutes for over 30 years. He says his highest calling has always been that of teacher. Dr. Greg Slayer.
Thank you, Elaine, and nice to see you all here. Elaine, Slayer is my street name. It's actually Salyer. So,
I'm sorry.
No, that's fine. I just didn't know how you knew my street name, but that's how I'm known. No, I'm just kidding. It happens all the time. I think it was even in the materials like that, so that's not your fault.
Yeah.
It's great to be here with you. I am an Angelino. I love Los Angeles. I was not born here, which even makes me an Angelino more so. But it is my adopted hometown. And a few years ago, I was president of the Philosophical Research Society here in Los Feliz, where I am right now. And I did a couple of lecture series on Los Angeles, and this is one of them, but I've retooled it for you all, improved it, I think. We'll see. Anyway, I'm really happy that you showed up for this. It's a weird little topic, but I hope it makes sense to you, because I think it really gets at something about Los Angeles and California that is pretty evident to me as a professor of mythology and stuff like that. And I think it'll work for you too. I think you'll see the city differently after this, or not. Anyway, here's what I have to offer now. I'm going to kill my camera because I'm going to read, and I don't want you to see that face, when someone's reading. Mine is not a good face to begin with, but when I'm reading, it's even scrunchier. So I'm just going to turn my camera off if I can. Could somebody do that for me? I'm in full screen and I can't really see my mouse. Oh, perfect.
Gotcha.
Great. Thank you so much. All right. That photo, by the way, anybody recognize that place?
No.
That is the Madonna Inn in San Luis Obispo.
Yes.
Yeah. All right, here we go. Creation Stories of Los Angeles. And of course, my iPad is frozen right as I get ready to start. All right. Excuse me just a sec. Well, let me try my iPhone. I am in a 1928 Hollywood courtyard building, made famous by the Zweibels. So you may hear strange things from the courtyard. Oh, here it is. Okay, good. All right, here we go. This is a quote from Kevin Starr. And if you want to know anything about California, you should read Kevin Starr. He is the historian of California, and he has a unique writing gift. So he's just a beautiful writer, which is not often typical for historians. And so here's his quote. I think this was in the course description. With so many languages, so many tribes and tribelets, so many autonomous communities, Native American California offered a paradigm of linguistic and cultural diversity, anticipating the population patterns of a later era, anticipating the population patterns of a later era when the peoples of the world arrived in the region. I think that's a good place to start because it is Southern California beginning in myth of the native, its indigenous peoples. And that continues to this day, if you look at just the land and the stories. In his 1911 book, The Soul of the Indian, Ohiyesa, he was known by his English name, Charles Eastman, shared a remarkable account of contact between Europeans and native people. And it reveals the nature of stories and how they're treated in their respective cultures. A missionary, this is Eastman, I'm quoting, a missionary once undertook to instruct a group of Indians in the truths of his holy religion. He told them of the creation of the earth in 6 days and of the fall of our first parents by eating an apple. Probably not an apple, but doesn't matter. The courteous savages, this is Eastman's word, the courteous savages listened attentively, and after thanking him, one related in his turn a very ancient tradition concerning the origin of the maize or corn. But the missionary plainly just showed his disgust and disbelief indignantly, saying, "What I delivered to you were sacred truths, but this that you tell me is mere fable and falsehood." "My brother," gravely replied the offended Indian, "it seems you have not been well grounded in the rules of civility. You saw that we who practice these rules believed your stories. Why then do you refuse to believe ours?" I love this little story. Love it. For one, it gets at the profoundly different understandings of the role of myth in Western culture versus how most of our human history has understood story and myth by its indigenous and other cultures. I've taught entire courses on this issue, but let me succinctly present some insights here that so we can use them to understand the City of Angels and its mythological dimensions. The missionary is working within a belief system that's based on a notion of truth. In this perspective, the idea is to reduce the entire world to a single truth. And once you have it, to compel other people to believe it as you declare any other notion of truth false. I don't know if you're familiar with this, but yeah. It is then reductionistic. In fact, such is the history of Western culture, and the compulsion to believe the truth takes the form of everything from a pen to a gun. It is from this idea that we get the understanding of myth as a lie, or as the missionary puts it, fable and falsehood. And that's what most people carry around as their understanding of myth. It's a lie. So you need to bust a myth, right? That's not what we're talking about. The native people in this story are not oriented toward truth, and that predictably frustrates and angers the missionary. What they are oriented toward instead is meaning. What's the difference? Well, all the difference in the world, actually. We might even say it's a different world altogether. Fundamentally, the missionary has only one story, just one, which he calls truth. But the native people have many stories because for them, stories offer meaning, and you can have as many meanings as the stories you can tell. Sharing stories is to share meanings. So the more stories and the more meanings, the better, which is why they offered their story about corn in response to the missionary's story about sin. It's an act of meaning sharing, not to mention an act of kindness. Further, they believe the missionary's stories. What does that mean? It means that they believe it's a story that is meaningful for the missionary. It's that simple. And they're confused as to why he's reacting so rudely and will not believe their story in turn. The missionary sees stories themselves as threats to his truth, much like Plato did when he attempted to shift from a storytelling society to one based on truth as obtained through dialectic or rational processes. Oh, wait, here's my other challenge. I've got to advance my slides as I read. Here we go. By the way, I hope I've got some interesting images for you here. All right. So by framing this study as the creation myths of the City of Angels, I do not mean the popular connotation of myth. We're not going to uncover all the fables and falsehoods of Los Angeles. Besides, the New York Times does that once a year. In fact, our exploration is really about the opposite of myth as a lie. I'm interested in the stories we tell ourselves as a city and as Angelenos that are true. And they're true because they're meaningful, and they're meaningful because we live them out. We might not even know these stories because we don't need to know a story to live it out. We're living out stories that are in our unconscious or just beneath our consciousness all the time. In fact, in Western culture, it's more likely you will not know the story you're living out because it resides so deeply in your unconscious, and it's been covered over by these notions of truth. You will still have the story, or better yet, it has you. What does that mean for Los Angeles? Los Angeles is a world created by stories, and you're going to see that's quite literally the case. I want the deepest stories. I want the stories with meanings that make the city what it is and what I am as an Angeleno. All right, I'm going to sync up my slides better now. From now on, I got it. That's the oldest photographic image of Los Angeles, by the way, early 1860s. Isn't that awesome? All right. I love etymologies, and I love it even more when etymologies create mysteries and meaning. So the history of the word city begins with the Latin word civitas, and that means citizenship, condition, or rights of the citizen, membership in the community. But there is something called Proto-Indo-European, and I won't get into the weeds on this, but it's basically a language that we don't have except in the form of roots in the existing Indo-European language. In other words, it's kind of what's behind all the languages in Indo-European, in the Indo-European cluster. Behind that word for city, civitas, is the notion to lie, also forming words for bed or couch, and with a secondary sense of beloved or dear. Isn't that interesting? Our oldest notion of a city, then, is a place where we find community and rest because we're gathered around something beloved or dear. And that's probably going to be a river. It's probably not something romantic. It's a river and arable land, probably. and good weather, speaking of Los Angeles. All right, so what would that mean for a city to be beloved or dear and a place where you can lie down and rest? Well, if you look at the history of cities, they do not emerge out of nothing, accidentally or in just any kind of place. They emerge in particular places at particular times for particular reasons. And as I mentioned, two of the main reasons, of course, are food and water. Not surprisingly, great cities of the world emerge in river valley settlements by the very course of nature. If you have a food and water supply, if you're not being attacked, if you have a safe place, then you can rest. In a city, you're not out hunting and gathering. You're resting in one spot near food and water and with safety. You can create a city, which is really, I think the PIE is right. It's really about a place to rest if you compare it to life outside of cities, which is much more dramatic and dangerous and difficult to survive in. Interesting things begin to happen when we rest. For example, if we're not moving around, then we begin to mark our place. If we're planting and not hunting, then we have to determine where to plant seeds and how many bushels of a crop we'll need to make it through the winter or non-growing seasons. Accordingly, we need some sort of accounting to keep ourselves alive. And accounting is the beginning of writing. So a city is where you can rest, it's where you can make a home, a community, even a civilization, which is what happens when we settle in one place over a very long period. Structures need to be built, laws need to be created, and needs such as sanitation must be provided for. Eventually, we come to hold such places dear. What about myth? Well, it has another interesting etymology. The word myth is older than etymologies can account for, in fact, which makes sense since it is prominent in oral cultures before writing. It's clearly related to the words for speech, thought, word, discourse, and conversation. Older even than those ideas seems to be the notion of myth as what comes out of the mouth, which again speaks to its use in oral cultures before writing. There's even some suggestion that the word myth shares the same root of that as mother. So that resonates with what we've already stated about the power of myth as a story that lives deeply within us. Stories are our mothers, and they nurture us in a strange, dangerous, and meaningful world. Now, there's a theory of myth that applies to every instance of myth and specifically to our topic. So I want to introduce you to it briefly. Roland Barthes was a French semiotician, one who studies signs, who wrote a little book called Mythologies, which is a set of short symbolic interpretations of cultural activities and objects. For example, he analyzes the meanings of milk and wine. Right? Think about it. Think about what milk signifies and what wine signifies. They're almost opposites. He analyzes wrestling. He analyzes an image of a Black French soldier saluting the French tricolor flag, right? And he wrote this in the 50s before the internet, so it's become even more relevant. At the end of this little volume is an essay titled Myth Today. And while it's a difficult read, it's a profound statement on the meaning and functions of myth. And let me just pull a few relevant ideas from his essay for our discussion of Los Angeles. Myth is a type of speech. First of all, Barthes calls myth a type of speech. That's a way of interacting through language that is laden with symbols, what Barthes calls signs, from which we get the term semiotics, or the study of signs. According to Barthes, we do not make myth out of everyday speech. We make it out of a special kind of speech, a way of talking that tends toward deeper meanings, even if it's not designed to be. So the interpreter of a myth actually has more power than the teller of the myth. Now, let me say that again, because we're going to see it over and over. The interpreter of a myth, of a story, a profound story, has more power than the teller. To be more accurate, the cultural interpretations of a myth have more power than the tellers. All right. The next nugget of Barth's theory explains why this is the case. Myth is stolen language. If the cultural interpretation of a myth is more powerful than the telling, then it is ripe for theft, and it happens all the time. In fact, the stolen language of myth might properly be seen as the rule rather than the exception, a feature rather than a bug, and a demonstration of the power of myth to make meaning. Let me give you a sense of just how prominent this process is in world literature, mythology, and religion. The Genesis myth of creation was stolen from the Mesopotamian creation myth called Enuma Elish, which means when on high. The Jesus story itself was stolen from the stories of Osiris, Mithra, and Sol Invictus, a Roman religion. In Persia, Zoroaster stole the meaning of the pantheon of the Hindu devas and incorporated them into a new monotheism. Just the opposite, from a polytheistic pantheon to a monotheistic one. More recently in world literature, we see James Joyce stealing Odysseus and placing him in Dublin in one day instead of in Ithaca for a lifetime. We see the Paiute medicine man Wovoka creating the ghost dance out of the book of Revelation, and it goes on and on. Stealing language is what we do to make meaning. We use the stories we or others have told before to tell the stories we need to tell now, especially when now looks difficult, hopeless, apocalyptic. Finally, myth transforms history into nature. This is so powerful. Myth takes something that did happen, pardon me, and presents it as something that had to happen. If you read about creation myths, scholars will show that such stories are about order coming from chaos. For example, and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was on the face of the deep. And that is exactly right, even for indigenous and Eastern creation stories, such as in the Vedas or the Chinese Great Egg myth. These make for wonderful and fascinating stories, but I think if we look at the function of creation myths, we can expand them to include any story that places some kind of order onto the world through language, right? And so you're stealing from wherever and using it in the present and in your local environment. This is myth transforming history into nature. It's something that happened and now is inevitable. For example, why are we afraid of snakes? A particular interpretation of the Genesis myth tells us that it's because the serpent tricked us in the beginning. In Chinese mythology, an eclipse is the frog swallowing the moon. And if you believe in this myth, it's easy to see it happening as the giant frog's jaws close in on the moon. Barth's point then is that while myth is myriad and malleable, it also gets interpreted as the opposite, singular and fixed. Myth transforms history into nature. All right. In his Nobel Prize acceptance speech, Peruvian writer Mario Vargas Llosa reveals that writers write because they want a different world. And creation stories tell us that new worlds are made by words, as in, and God said, let there be light, and there was light. Creation stories then appear when we want to make a new world and leave the chaos of the current world, which is exactly what happened with one of the Genesis creation stories. There are actually two. Genesis 1:1 to 2:4 was written several centuries after the beginning, likely by a priest and for specific uses by Persian Jews living in a diaspora. Here's another example. Excuse me. The coolest person I know is my friend Mads. I saw him this morning. He's not yet 2. He turns 2, I think, on Saturday. So he's living next Saturday. He's living the Genesis myth every day. Mads names things in order to create his world. And like God in the Genesis myth, he sees that it is good. It is harder, however, to get him to rest on the Sabbath or during nap time. For Mads, a beboppy is what you and I know as a fruit pouch. A dippy dip is hummus. And my favorite, an avocado, is an akodi. Also, he recently decided that a spider is an itsy bitsy. Now tell me that doesn't make more sense than the words we use. My point is that Mads and the ancient Jews who created the first Genesis myth have one thing in common. They make worlds, entire worlds, through language. And specifically, the act of naming is an act of creation. Once worlds are made through language, how do we make meaning in these worlds? The answer is freely and with great variety. For example, let's assume that the Genesis creation story is our myth, which is a fair assumption for many Americans. And in fact, you're going to see it appear in the mythology of Los Angeles quite a bit. What is the meaning of the story? That is, how does it transform from story, the simple lore or fable, into myth? As best we can tell, this is a story that was born in exile and offered by a group of Jews dealing with the fact that they were separated from their promised land and the temple that was the sacred space of their culture and worship. As such, they wrote a story that made their God, the creator of the entire world, who was, like them, obsessed with bringing order to chaos or putting things back to the way they were at creation. 20th century poet Wallace Stevens would describe this notion as a blessed rage for order. And his century and ours would steal this myth from the exiled Jews in Persia who likely wrote it. How then do we make meaning from a stolen myth? Easy, perhaps too easily, we might add. We steal this myth and we add the psychological interpretation that is more conducive to our own age. Accordingly, I would say that the Genesis story is one about the loss of innocence. Nearly all of us begin in a time and place where nothing is wrong and everything is provided for us if we're fortunate. We're naked and not ashamed. And Mads, my friend Mads, hates clothes. He's always taking them off because he's not ashamed. Well, what is shame, he would say. We learn to see good and evil, male and female, light and dark. And suddenly the world has changed. There is now danger, difference, and death. This is what creation stories do. Again, we do not have to be able to name this story. You may be hearing that interpretation for the first time, but we live it out regardless. In fact, most myths work most powerfully when we're unaware of them. So the content of a creation story is always about the past, but the real meaning and usefulness of the myth is about the present. All right. For the remainder of our time, let's examine creation stories from California, stories that have become meaningful for the people who have lived here. The indigenous peoples of this area in California are remarkably diverse. And I'm going to give you more of that Kevin Starr quote from the beginning here. Here's the full passage. And it's just, I share it because he just writes so well and understands the area so well, the region. Quote, the early inhabitants of California found in their various regions more than enough flora and fauna, he's talking about indigenous people, to sustain their lives. They were therefore not warlike in their relationships with each other, although quasi-realistic conflicts over disputed territories were not unknown. Large-scale political organizations were equally unnecessary. With no need to make war, they did not develop elaborate hierarchies. With nature relatively abundant, simple and effective technologies for hunting and gathering sufficed, although in their woven storage baskets, the native California women achieved an art form that was also eminently practical. No real difference between art and craft in native cultures. Theirs was a world of river, creek, or desert oasis, and of settlements that could easily be moved. Their therapy, their sociology even, and certainly their community life was centered on sweat lodges, where they warmed themselves with steam from water poured on fire-heated stones before plunging into a nearby river or lake, emerging renewed. In matters of property, they tended to be communal. In matters sexual, they tended toward balance and restraint, with full regard for the rearing of children. Their ego, as far as we can tell, was not the self-conscious, self-regarding ego of post-Renaissance Europe, but rather an awareness of the interior. The agriculturalists of the Southeast all had their cultures determined over the centuries by what was there in the first place, by California itself. The world was anchored in a story that had first been told when Coyote created the world and the human beings in it. And it was a continuing story in which they were also participating from birth to death in a flow of time that was circular, pervasive, and nonlinear, end quote. I've done much of my work in Native American cultures, and if you know anything about the history of white people trying to understand indigenous cultures, you may be hearing a whiff of romanticism here in Starr's account. I assure you it is not overstated or romanticized. His elegant prose aside, Kevin Starr is devoted to the discipline of history more than romanticizing the past. Oh, see, I missed that, sorry. Okay. Rainbow Bridge. In fact, let us hear from a Native person herself, and you may know the story of the Rainbow Bridge from the Chumash people.
Haku Lahumpwashwashtets. My name is Julie Tumamayat Stensley. I am an island descendant. My father, Vincent Tumamayat, the son of Cecilio Tumamayat, and the grandson of Juan de Jesus Tumamayat. Our families come from Santa Cruz Island and Santa Rosa Island, from villages such as Schwahil, La Upsh, Nanuani, and Maschal on Santa Cruz, and from the village of Hechaman on Santa Rosa Island. Sahipaka, once upon a time. Here on this beautiful island that we call Limu, meaning in the sea. You know it today as Santa Cruz Island. Mother Earth, Hutash, was out here. And as she had created many things here on the island, she thought something was missing. So she went to a very special plant and she gathered some magic seeds. And she threw the seeds out into the earth here on the island. And pretty soon, up from the ground, up from this beautiful earth, grew these beautiful people. She gave them many gifts here and showed them how to live happily on this island. Well, her husband, Achuoposh, the sky snake, today we know him as the Milky Way, he wanted to give the people a gift too, so he gave them the gift of fire by shooting a bolt of lightning to the ground. Well, the fires burned hot, and they kept warm with these fires. and they cooked their food. The villages started to grow and be populated with more and more children. Pretty soon, with all the noise from these children, Hutash was annoyed, and she decided that it was time for these people to move on and to move to another place. So she said to herself, I've got to think of some place to put these people, a different place, a place where they could spread out and be very happy. Well, the next morning she gathered all the people up to a very high mountain, Siwot, or as we know it today, Mount Diablo. And as she told the people to look, as they looked up into the sky across the ocean, they saw a beautiful, beautiful rainbow, Wishdoyo. And she told them that that image was a rainbow bridge. And the rainbow bridge was going to take them to a new land that was very large, and they could fill that with people. Well, as people started to climb over the bridge and cross over, many became very dizzy and very frightened because there was a mist and a fog below. They couldn't even see the ocean. Well, as they started falling off, crying out to Hutash for help, she took pity and she changed them and transformed them into dolphins. And that is what we call our brothers and sisters today of the ocean, Alakoi. Those people who crossed over on the bridge went to a place called Tismahu, where it steams out. Today we know that place is Carpinteria, and the people came off that rainbow bridge and spread out into all these beautiful places on our mainland. And that is all.
And here is a Tongva myth that begins when there was nothing at all, as many creation myths do. There was nothing, all was darkness. Then two quarrelsome brother deities, sea god and land god, worked together to beget land, sea, and animals. The brothers fell into discord, however, over their opposing visions for the human form. The disagreement turned disastrous when the land god decided to create people to his liking while the sea god was away. When the sea god returned and saw what had been done in his absence, he became very angry and threatened to destroy his brother and humanity by flooding the land. At that time, the land was perfectly level. Sea god plunged into the sea and caused huge waves to rise and roll over the land. The land god first raised up hills and the high mountains to protect himself and humanity from the sea, and so thwarted the evil designs of his brother. It was believed that land god, from his position at the apex of Mount San Antonio, sculpted these ramparts that thwarted the sea god. Around the same mountain, according to another legend, the Yuhaviatam people, known as the Serranos, came to settle after following, quote, a pure white eagle, the bird of their great captain, Kukitak, or a land god from the north. The symbolic peak of Mount San Antonio marked an approximate boundary between their territory, which primarily occupied the eastern end of the San Gabriels and parts of the San Bernardino Mountains, and the expansive realm of the Tongva, later known as the Gabrielinos, to the west. All right, so I don't know about you, but those stories sound much more interesting. They do have a kind of fairy tale quality to us here who are not native or who are steeped in Western mythology, but we should not mistake that for any lack of power. If you believe these stories, and these people believe these stories, like the peoples in the story Charles Eastman told, then you're going to look at dolphins very differently, aren't you? You're going to look at the land, the mountains, the San Gabrielino Mountains, very differently. You're going to, if you see them as the result of a battle between two gods. I kind of wish we still did that. All right, carrying on. Spanish creation mythology. This gets so interesting. I love this story. California begins as a country in a novel. That is, as a fictional place. forgive my Spanish pronunciation, García Ordóñez de Montalvo wrote Las Tergas de Esplandian, The Adventures of Esplandian, in 1510, right? The title figure, Esplandian, was the son of Amadis of Gaul. And here again, excuse me, is Kevin Starr to describe the novel. According to Esplandian's allies at the siege were Californians, a race of Black Amazons under the command of Queen Calafia. And there she is on the right in the Mark Hopkins Hotel in San Francisco. Isn't she amazing? According to Montalvo, California, where Queen Calafia is from, was an island to the right of the Indies, very close to this side of the terrestrial paradise, abounding in gold and precious stones. Well, we could do a whole talk on just Europeans getting lost in the West. So obviously this is not near the Indies, but that's okay. We finally figure it out. The Californians rode griffins into battle and fought with golden weapons. Queen Calafia herself was, quote, very large in person, the most beautiful of all of them, of blooming years, and in her thoughts, desirous of achieving great things, strong of limb and of great courage. Equipping a fleet, Calafia had sailed to Constantinople. Again, this is all in the novel. Constantinople, which wouldn't have been far if you're in the Indies, or as far, to join the other great captains of the world. So she was a warrior in a siege against the Turks. And by the end of the story, and this always happens, I can go on and on about this, how powerful women in creation mythology get tamed. Sure enough, Calafia herself gives up her promiscuous ways and marries one of Esplandian's trusted lieutenants, with whom she goes on further adventures. So 1533, the Spanish expedition lands on Baja, and by 1539, they are calling this land California, all from a novel. I love this. She, Calafia, a Black Amazon, is the mother of California. We Californians then are a very interesting mistake, which could be the theme of the whole state, if you think about it. Eventually, the Spanish discovered their mistake and realized that this land was not an island, but a peninsula. So they named it Baja, which means lower. And the Spanish, I find this fascinating too, the Spanish would not return to California for 230 years. There was just nothing here for them, they thought. Fiction creates reality. This is one of the myths of Los Angeles. Well, of course, they did come back in the form of the Jesuits and Saint Ignatius Loyola. And this, like all California myths, are just fascinating. So the Jesuits, you may know, were founded by Loyola. He was a soldier turned priest. And the order eventually consisted of scholars, educators, missionaries, and advisors to power, and still does, by the way. I mean, I'm a professor, and if you want a good education, you could do worse than go to a Jesuit university. They are devoted to education. The Jesuits understood their role according to the Genesis myth, which was interpreted to support the colonization of the New World. They were unique, however, in that their belief was enculturation was preferable to extermination. Extermination was the rule for most of this continent, either by accident, through disease, or by deliberate genocide. But the Jesuits did not want that. They wanted them to become encultured, to learn Western culture, in this case, Spanish culture. They were not interested in annihilating them. They wanted to save them. And that's, I know that reeks of paternalism and all kinds of bad things, but comparatively, they weren't out to kill them. And they did try to educate them. Now, an interesting study, I think, would be Spanish or other Europeans who did not favor the colonial enterprise. And there were some. You may not know this, but there was a man, a friar named Bartolome de las Casas, who wrote a tract called, it gets translated into English as The Devastation of the Indies. It consists of letters back to Spain, pleading with Charles V to stop the enslavement and brutalization of indigenous people. This was in Hispaniola, which is now the Dominican Republic in Haiti. Las Casas feared, he was not especially concerned about the native people, but he feared God was going to punish the Spanish for what they were doing to these people. The Jesuits, likewise, were not as voracious as their other Christian colonizing cousins. They clearly wanted to make indigenous people Catholic, but they did so by trying to protect them, and there was plenty to protect them from, as we will see. They imagined a California of spiritual enclaves, little gardens of Eden, you might say, intimate utopias. They called these little islands of perfection, where the kingdom of God could be realized. It was an interesting ideal and ideology. They were pretty much autonomous. They were pretty much autonomous, pardon me, and operated separately from the state and from the church, which enabled them to run their own game here. And this is really important. They were doing their own thing apart from the church and crown. And as we know, if you try to do that, you put a target on your back, and the institutions will come after you. In fact, by the 1760s, there was a growing conviction that the Jesuits were governing everything in California, pardon me, and across the world on their own terms, without allegiance or fealty to the state church. They were said to be a church within the church and a state within the state, which was not good for the Catholic Church in the Spanish Empire. And like all Edens, the Jesuit California ended with a fall. By the way, there's a great film about this. Pardon me, let me get a drink. From the 80s with Jeremy Irons and Robert De Niro called The Mission. That's set in South America. All right. Eden within Eden within Eden, little islands of perfection. So, of course, the Jesuits could not continue to operate like that. And the Franciscans come in, replace the Jesuits with the Franciscans. Spanish governor, replace the Jesuits with the Franciscans. And that's a whole other creation story. And I bet you know this story, especially if you're an Angelino and you went to school here. You know of Father Junipero Serra, who founded several of the missions along the Camino Real, which we now call the 5 and the 101, along with some other routes. The Franciscans were also very different from other colonizers, kind of the opposite of the Jesuits. Serra was a small man, a diminutive friar, just over 5 feet in height, and he loved suffering, physical suffering. This is called in Christianity the mortification of the flesh. It is said that he slept on a board bed, scourged himself, and lacerated his flesh with stones in the course of giving a sermon. Kevin Starr writes that Sarah represented a unique paradox. That is, a priest formed by almost medieval piety who was given a crucial assignment to establish a civil society in the emerging California. How does an ascetic, one prone to masochism, establish a civil society? How does one take an intimate and painful religious ritual and use it to create a state? And so, as Starr writes, the sacred expedition of the Franciscans to remove the Jesuits from power and to found the missions of California, of course, was a phantasmagoria of physical hardship, deprivation, suffering, and death. Okay. Sorry if you can hear that. Okay. Okay, maybe it'll stop. Maybe you don't even hear it.
No, we didn't.
Okay, if it continues, I'll just move. Let's see. So that was, you may know, the Sacred Expedition, as it's called in California history, and you may know this story, but here it is. In fact, you'll see it on the plaza downtown. On September 4th, 1781, the birthday of Los Angeles, 44 Hispanic men, women, and children of Native American, African, and European descent departed from the mission San Gabriel Archangel, accompanied by 2 mission priests and 4 soldiers. Los Puebladores, the settlers, walked 9 miles to a location on the banks of the Los Angeles River. There they established the Pueblo, the town of the Queen of the Angels. And here again is Kevin Starr's account of Sarah's Franciscan mission system. Quote, "Yet even a sympathetic observer acknowledging the benevolent intent of the mission system must see it by the standards of the 21st century as a violent intrusion into the culture and human rights of indigenous peoples." Helicopter. For more than 25 generations, Native Americans had lived harmoniously in their own cherished places under the terms of the cultures they had evolved. They had their own myths and rituals, their own way of life, their own fulfillments and dreams, and now they were being forced from their homelands, brought into a mission system frequently against their will, and treated as children not yet possessed of full adulthood, not yet the people, the gentle people of reason. As children, which was a phrase, the people of reason, that's what the missions were trying to create, starting with the children. They could be beaten when they proved recalcitrant or ran away, as they frequently did, and were recaptured. Some of them made the transition successfully and were Hispanicized into productive farmers, artisans, vaqueros, and choral singers. Yet many died of shock, just of shock, at their displacement or of Spanish diseases. You may know that indigenous people had no natural immunity to the diseases that were brought from Europe. The sexual exploitation of Native American females by Spanish soldiers and other men in the colony was devastating as a matter of both personal violation and venereal disease. In contrast to Mexico, intermarriage was infrequent. The Native American population dropped precipitously, was most likely halved, in fact, by the end of the Spanish-Mexican era. It is difficult, in short, to see the mission system as resulting in anything other than the wholesale anthropological devastation whatever the sincerely felt evangelical intent of the missionaries and the civilizing goals of the laws of the Indies. Okay, I'm going to move now. Pardon me. Getting away from the grinder that decided to start up right outside my window. All right, pardon me just a second. All right. This is better. I'll just get in bed while I talk. How awesome. Best lecture ever. Okay, where am I? All right, thanks for your patience. That is the Franciscan fall from grace, to employ the Genesis myth yet again. Aspirations run aground of existential reality, and ideological blindness leads to brutal and sinful behavior. And this too is myth, by the way. All right. Now this is funny. I love this. What is the name of Los Angeles? Well, it's been a lot of different things and we're not sure. So that's the English translation of the Spanish. The town of Our Lady, Queen of the Angels of the river Porciuncula. Now, let's listen to Robert Peterson, who has a lovely podcast called The Hidden History of Los Angeles, about the name.
My name is Robert Peterson, and this is a hidden history of LA.
Today on Hidden History, we will take a look at the original name of Los Angeles.
Los Angeles,
LA,
Los Angeles,
Los Ángeles,
La La Land,
Los Angeles,
City of Angels,
Los Angeles.
Los Angeles.
There are many ways of saying it. LA, Los Angeles. Everybody knows the name is Spanish in origin. But what is lesser known is that there is no agreement as to what LA's original name was. What we do know is that the settlers who founded LA back in 1781 meant to name the town after angels. But beyond that, there is disagreement and debate. Some contend the original name was
el pueblo de Nuestra Señora de Los Ángeles,
Others assert it was
el pueblo de Nuestra Señora de Los Ángeles de la Porciuncula,
Wikipedia says it was,
el pueblo de Nuestra Señora de la Reina de Los Ángeles del Río de Porciuncula,
or maybe,
el pueblo de Nuestra Señora la Reina de Los Ángeles,
or,
el pueblo de Nuestra Señora la Reina de Los Ángeles del Río Porciuncula,
or,
el pueblo de la Reina de Los Ángeles sobre el Río de Porciuncula.
books, historical articles, plaques, monuments around downtown, many use different names. So then what was the original name of LA? For the answer, we'll look to the historians. First, we have Dois Nunes. Dois Nunes was a distinguished LA historian who died in 2011. He was a professor at USC, and for 43 years he was the editor of the Historical Society of Southern California scholarly publication, the Southern California Quarterly. Nunes believes the actual name of LA is
El pueblo de la Reina de Los Ángeles.
That means the town of the Queen of Angels. This name corresponds with a plaque beneath the statue of Spanish King Carlos III at the plaza by Olvera Street. The plaque describes the founding of El Pueblo de la Reina de Los Angeles in 1781. But then, just a few feet away, Another plaque uses a different name. The founder's plaque on the plaza refers to LA as
El pueblo de la Reina de Los Ángeles sobre el río de Porciúncula.
the town of the Queen of Angels on the Porciúncula River. So, if Nunes is right, the plaque below the statue of King Carlos III is right, but the founder's plaque is wrong. And it doesn't stop there. If Nunes is right, then the inscription on the plaque of the route of the settlers of the city of Los Angeles in Grand Park, which describes the founding of El Pueblo de Nuestra Señora la Reina de Los Ángeles de Porciúncula, is also wrong. Also wrong would be the carved wooden cross at the top of Olvera Street, which refers in Spanish to the town of Our Lady, the Queen of the Angels. Nunes blames much of the confusion on the writings of an early Franciscan priest who helped establish the California missions along with Junipero Serra. These writings described how early settlers founded the future town of Nuestra Señora de los Ángeles on the banks of the river named Porciúncula. Nunes believes that this was a mistake. He believes the original name of the pueblo never included anything about the river Porciúncula. Nunes' position is based on his interpretation of the founding documents, the documents created by LA's early settlers and the people who sent them. For example, in an order to recruit colonists to settle the new pueblo, the following language was used.
With the aims of defense, conservation, and development of the province of California, toward which the service of God and King is especially directed, I have resolved upon the erection of a pueblo with the title La Reina de Los Ángeles on the river of La Porciúncula.
Nunes believes that when the order referred to the river of La Porciúncula, it was indicating the site of the pueblo, not the title or name. But other historians have a different point of view. Next, we have Francis Weber. Francis Weber is a noted Catholic scholar and the archivist for the Archdiocese of Los Angeles. He is also a historian and author. Weber believes the city's original name is
El pueblo de Nuestra Señora de Los Ángeles de Porciúncula.
or the town of Our Lady of the Angels of Porciúncula. Weber contends that the inclusion of the word La Reina, or the Queen, not the river Porciúncula, is a mistake. He believes the words La Reina, or the Queen, were added after the Portola expedition passed by the LA River back in 1769. Weber contends that the pueblo was actually named after a religious celebration that occurred around the time the Portola expedition came through LA. So, we have two historians who disagree. That's not unusual. But what makes this dispute so interesting is that not only were Weber and Nunes distinguished LA historians, they were best friends for over 45 years. An LA Times article about the name debate quoted Weber as saying,
It is the only thing I know of that we don't agree on. Of course, he's wrong, and I'm right.
Two learned LA historians who both extensively studied this issue, and who also happen to be best friends, could not agree on what LA's original name is. So, I imagine the debate will continue, and we may never know for sure. But what's in a name? I'm not going to quote Shakespeare, and I don't know if LA really smells sweet like a rose, but LA is still the LA we know today regardless of its original name. But the fact that the original name has, in a sense, been lost is representative of this city and its residents who too often forget our past. And the variety of different names is yet another example of how change seems to be the only constant in this city. And also how determining what is true or authentic in LA often depends on who you ask. So, next time you are on Olvera Street, walk onto the plaza and look at the various plaques and monuments and see how they characterize LA's original name and how many of them disagree. Searching for LA's original name on various plaques and monuments around downtown. These are just a few of the places where LA's hidden history lies. If you would like to see pictures related to this podcast or would like to learn more about the hidden history of LA, visit our website,
hiddenhistoryla.com.
All right. We're going to hear from Peterson again at the end about how to pronounce Los Angeles. his struggle there at the end is really emblematic, and I feel for him because he's an historian and he's trying to come to a definitive answer. But again, I remind you of the George Eastman story, the Charles Eastman story, where the native people don't have that problem. We believed your story. Why don't you believe ours? So the more stories, the better. LA is like that. It was born in fiction. There are many different ways of understanding its name, and as you'll see, even pronouncing its name. We can't agree on the name, even, which is both perfect and mythological. So it's now 2:22, and I have two more subjects I want to talk about: Mexican creation mythology and American creation mythology. Why don't we come back at whatever you all think, Anissa, maybe 10 minutes, and I'll pick it up again with just the last two. Anissa or Elaine?
That'll be fine. 10 minutes. So that'll be about 2:40. Wait a minute.
2:32?
2:32. I'm sorry.
That's all right. All right. I'll
Okay.
get a drink and anything else you need. I'll see you at 2:32. Okay, friends, we're back. Let me apologize for my challenges of reading from an essay and syncing my slides and also my environment, which can be anything from peaceful, quiet to a grinder right outside my window as someone's working on our fountain in the courtyard, to other things that you've probably heard in Los Angeles, people screaming and etc. So thank you for your patience. Like every professor I've ever known, I've gone over time. I thought that we would be about an hour, and I'm already beyond that. So let me tighten this up as we finish up with Mexican creation mythology and American creation mythology. The Mexican creation story of Los Angeles runs from a very short time, 1822 to 1848. And I think you probably know why it ended in 1848, but just in case you don't, that's the year that began the California gold rush and dramatic changes up and down the state. Mexican creation mythology is really about the land grant rancho. All right, highly romanticized period, probably not completely unwarranted, but still you're going to see what happens to this romanticization of this time period. Well, what is this? This is really interesting. So the Spanish missions that Serra founded became secularized, by the way, through the help of a very interesting guy named Figueroa. And the remaining padres were repatriated to Mexico City or Spain. So a new social institution, the land grant rancho, became predominant. All told, more than 600 land grants were made during the Mexican era. And these vast holdings, which were the missions holdings, went from coastal California and as far as north as Petaluma, and dominated the state economy and defined the world of Mexican Californians. It was the age of the great dons. And you may recognize some of the names because they're still in our geography. Don Jose Andres Sepulveda, the feudal lord of the 80 square mile Rancho San Joaquin in present-day Orange County. He received his land grant from Governor Alvarado. His grand hacienda was called the Refugio. Don Jose and his extended family lived a life that would be later celebrated as California legend. In fact, for a later generation, and we'll see this actually happen, rancho life represented California at its ideal. What was this life? Tell me if this doesn't sound like a creation story you know about a garden. I'm borrowing this from Kevin Starr again. It was a prodigal existence full of generous food and cattle roaming the hills. Families were large and extended. It was common for more than 20 relatives, near relatives, and friends to sit down to plentiful meals of beef tortillas, chili peppers, rice, tomatoes, etc. All of it was prepared by Indian cooks under the supervision of the mistress of the house. Families met for 3 full meals a day, mid-morning and mid-afternoon snacks. In a society challenged by the lack of civil institutions, 2 or 3 schools, 1 printing press, and the absence of urbanism, what do you do if you don't have those things? Family becomes central, the fundamental fact and premise of social life. You're connected by blood or by baptismal relationships, and no child went uncared for, which is amazing in itself. If one needed a horse, you borrowed it from the next rancho. At designated times of the year, religious feast days, etc., the ranchero or branding or a slaughter, the rancheros would gather their families and retainers at one another hacienda for week-long festivities that included late nights of dancing to the music of guitars, violins, etc., imported wine, domestic brandy, spiked punches. On such festive occasions, the Dons would dress in elaborate tarot riding suits and ride on silver-studded saddles that represented a significant portion of their wealth. Frankly, I'm surprised this lasted as long as it did, even though it was short, because it seems almost unreal and certainly has a tone of Eden before the fall. But apparently this was Mexican California for those few decades and for the people at the top. And now American creation mythology. From the Eden of the Rancho decades, something changed. What might that be? The answer is people like me came. People from the East, whites, Euro-Americans. Why did we come? Well, we came for a lot of reasons. The single biggest reason we came was a novel. And I love this again. We were born in fiction as a state. Los Angeles itself was populated by people coming to see the sights of the novel Ramona. So if you're interested in exploring this topic even more, especially the history, I recommend highly Kerry McWilliams' Southern California, an Island Upon the Land. He, together with Kevin Starr, really get into some interesting stuff. And he is so annoyed with Helen Hunt Jackson and this migration. Kerry McWilliams was a labor organizer. I think he even ran for governor once, and very progressive and very interested in workers' rights and et cetera. And he was just completely annoyed by this woman who wrote this novel, and it produced a tremendous migration to Los Angeles. You may have read or heard that during the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln said that what changed the Civil War was a novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin. And Nathaniel Hawthorne hated Harriet Beecher Stowe for that. And he called her and her kind a bunch of, quote, damn scribbling women, unquote, because it was sentimental and popular. Jackson's novel Ramona is dripping with sentimentality and romanticism, particularly in regard to the Mission period and the Rancho period that we just mentioned. And Williams, as a kind of neo-Marxist historian, despises it. So who was coming? Well, the people coming from the East were largely Protestant. And of course, this area had been, under the Spanish and Mexicans, Catholic. Suddenly now, though, in Helen Hunt Jackson's imaginary world, which quickly turned into the real world, it is the Protestants who have come here, and they are to blame. We might call this today white guilt, but Kerry McWilliams had never seen that before and was confused. Here's how he put it. Quote, considering the long dark record of Indian mistreatment in Southern California, it is difficult to account for the curious legend of Ramona that has developed in the region about the well-being of natives under mission rule. According to this legend, the missions were havens of happiness and contentment for the Indians, places of song, laughter, good food, and beautiful ranches, and the mystical adoration of Christ, unquote. We see this a lot in the colonization of the Americas, the idea that the newness of the land creates a blank slate, and a blank slate is ripe for writing a story on. Of course, it wasn't blank. Colonizers perceived it mythologically and ideologically as blank, and that worked to their own ends. The newness of the land itself seems, in fact, to have compelled, even demanded, a new mythology that could give people a sense of continuity in a region long characterized by rapid social dislocations. So there it is. That is the function of a creation mythology, to give people a story about where they are and what they're going through. McWilliams doesn't know he's talking about mythology, but he's actually talking about the function of a creation myth. It provides continuity. He goes on, and I imagine him shaking his head as he writes this. When the book was first published, Ramona, it provoked a storm of protest in the Southland. Egged on by various civic groups, the local critics denounced it as a tissue of falsehoods. Sounds familiar? A travesty of history and a damnable libel on Southern California, but the book was perfectly timed, providentially timed, to coincide with the great invasion of home seekers and tourists to the region as these hordes of winter tourists began to express a lively interest in visiting Ramona's land. Southern California experienced an immediate change of attitude and overnight became passionately Ramona conscious. Beginning about 1887, Ramona promotion of fantastic proportions began to be organized in the region, unquote. So Ramona promotion, come see the land of Ramona, take the train, coincides with the arrival of the railroad and the discovery of oil in Los Angeles. I was talking to someone the other day who was saying, hey, I saw an oil derrick somewhere on Wilshire. And I'm like, yeah, Los Angeles was the center of America's oil reserves for many years. It was indeed, as McWilliams said, a providential timing, some sort of amazing confluence of history, literature, and technology, because the train now has arrived. And so people flow into Los Angeles in the late 19th century. We can look at the tables of the population growth, and I encourage you to do this. Look at the population history of Los Angeles. It spikes when Ramona is published. And again, this makes no sense, but I love it because it's so Los Angeles. It's because the population of Los Angeles grows exponentially because of a sentimental novel about a Mexican girl and a, quote, half-breed, unquote, native man who fall in love and are not accepted by their cultures. It's Romeo and Juliet in Southern California. While it's sentimental, it's also really dark and does not end well. I'll not spoil it for you. But the story of Ramona and her sentimental suffering brought people here. It may have brought your ancestors here. I think of the story of this novel every time I'm in Hollywood, and I live right next to Hollywood. And it would not be an exaggeration to say that we're the storytelling capital of the world and of the world history. We live by and for stories here. Let me conclude with a little lesson on Los Angeles in terms of how to pronounce the city's name. Guess what? We don't know. This is Robert Peterson again. Let me just, you may recognize that scene from The Big Lebowski where the drifter pronounces it very different than we know. All right, here we go.
Yeah, my name is Robert Peterson, and this is Q&A.
LA. Today's question.
What is a proper way to pronounce Los Angeles?
The short answer is that it depends on whether you're using the Spanish or anglicized pronunciation. The Spanish pronunciation is Los Angeles, and the anglicized pronunciation is Los Angeles. But that answer doesn't tell the whole story. You see, if you asked an Angelino that question 100 years ago, you would have received a different response. For almost a century, there was a heated debate about how to properly pronounce the name of the city. For example, author Charles Lummis wrote in 1914,
"There is no other city in the world whose inhabitants so miserably and shamelessly, and with so many varieties of foolishness, miscall the name of the town they live in.
For the record, Lummis pronounced it Los Angeles. At the time, Lummis counted no less than 12 distinct permutations of the city's name in circulation, in addition to his own.
Los Angeles.
Los Angeles.
Los Angeles.
Los Angeles.
Los Angeles.
And these variations would appear on radio and TV. Here's Bing Crosby.
We met on a train coming from Los Angeles.
Don Wilson from The Jack Benny Show.
Now let's pick them up on the Super Chief en route to Los Angeles.
L.A. Mayor Sam Yorty.
To try and elect a mayor for the city of Los Angeles.
A character in Alfred Hitchcock's 1942 film Saboteur.
I'm looking for a man named Frank Fry. I met him up in Los Angeles.
Even Bugs Bunny.
Don't look much like Los Angeles to me. I knew I should have taken that left turn at Albuquerque.
So, how did we get to the pronunciation that we use today, Los Angeles? Well, let's go back to the beginning. In 1781, the original 44 pobladores who settled here spoke Spanish, so they pronounced the name Los Angeles. Well, the original name was actually longer than that. We don't know for sure how much longer, but it was longer. Some argue the original name was El Pueblo del Reino de Los Angeles. Others argue it was El Pueblo de Nuestra Señora de Los Angeles de Porciúncula. And some think it was something else entirely. Nevertheless, the two words at issue for our discussion today were pronounced Los Angeles. If you want to hear the full story behind the city's original name, check out episode 4 of our podcast. Now, back to pronunciation. So, starting in 1781, Angelenos pronounced the name Los Angeles. And this lasted for about a century, until demographic changes started affecting how the town's name was being pronounced. The Pueblo became an American town in 1847, but it wasn't until the 1880s, when large numbers of English-speaking Americans started flowing into the city, and people really started anglicizing the name. And this was the start of almost a century-long debate as to how to properly pronounce the city's name. Some wanted to stick with the Spanish pronunciation. Others advocated for different variations of anglicized pronunciations. An LA Times article from 1918 put it this way.
One of the mooted questions among visitors in Southern California is the proper pronunciation of the name Los Angeles. Although the Times daily instructs the uninitiated, varied pronunciations are in vogue, and it now seems doubtful if ever the soft Spanish accent will prevail.
The Times advocated for the Spanish pronunciation and actually printed its preferred pronunciation, Los Angeles, under the paper's masthead. But many English-speaking Angelenos expressed difficulties with the Spanish pronunciation. For example, it was reported that in 1912, a teacher at Selma Avenue Grammar School was assigned the duty of teaching her students the Spanish pronunciation of the city. But she faced an unexpected obstacle. When attempting to say Los Angeles, it apparently sounded like the students were saying hell. Los Angeles. Word got back to the parents that students were saying hell in class, which at the time was a big no-no. The teacher tried to explain that the students were not saying hell, but the damage was already done. The school immediately stopped all attempts to teach the Spanish pronunciation. So, even with advocacy from the LA Times, the Spanish pronunciation of the city did not win out. In 1934, the United States Board of Geographic Names decreed that the name should be anglicized to Los Angeles. As expected, the Times was not happy with the decree, arguing that the pronunciation made the city sound like some brand of fruit preserve. But dropping the Spanish pronunciation did not put an end to the debate. People continued to argue about the, quote, proper anglicized version. Should you say a hard G or a soft G? Los Angeles or Los Angeles? Should you end with a les or a lus? Los Angeles? Los Angeles? In 1952, the mayor of the city, Fletcher Bowron, impaneled a jury of experts to, once and for all, settle the question. The little pueblo had grown to become the third largest city in the country. But people were still unsure what to call it. A final decision was needed. So a panel of experts was chosen to render a verdict and proclaim an official pronunciation of the city. The jury was made up of professors, representatives from the press, radio announcers, and the Historical Society of Southern California. And after deliberating, they came to a verdict. The official pronunciation would be Los Angeles. The mayor announced the verdict during one of his Thursday night fireside chat speeches.
Citizens of Los Angeles, you will note that I address you in the accustomed way, but with a different pronunciation of the name of our city. For a great many years, I've been accustomed to the use of the hard G, Los Angeles. The citizen jury has rendered its verdict. I accept that verdict. I yield to the expression of the majority, and from henceforward I will pronounce the fair name of our great city, Los Angeles.
Mayor Bowern, a self-professed hard G man, stated, "This means breaking the habit of a near lifetime, but I'll go along." Interestingly, Mayor Bowern was actually more worried about another deviation of the city's name. The Times reported in 1952 that
the mayor prayed that civic pride would prevent its citizens from ever referring to it as L.A.
he lost that battle as well. Some, though, were not as easygoing with the verdict. The Los Angeles Herald-Express ran a headline stating that civic leaders balked on the chosen pronunciation and even put the Webster's Dictionary pronunciation on the front page of the newspaper to contradict the now official pronunciation. The paper also quoted a civic leader who disagreed with the mayor's experts.
I do not agree with the so-called jury. Los Angeles should be pronounced as it reads, that is, Los Angeles. And I also wish someone would get radio and television people to pronounce rodeo correctly. It isn't rodeo, it's rodeo.
And radio announcer Red Blanchard later said of the decision,
the city council took a vote and decided on the official pronunciation of Los Angeles from that moment on would be Los Angeles. Well, I never could say that. I don't want to say it, and I won't say it. And those pinkos in the city hall can't make me say it. Well, so much for Los Angeles.
Nevertheless, the city now had an official anglicized pronunciation. A senior librarian was appointed to head a committee to notify all publishers of dictionaries, as well as all radio and television stations and boards of education and libraries. While there have been occasional deviations over the years, Los Angeles has become the standard anglicized version of the city's name. It should be noted that the Spanish pronunciation of the city's name has never changed. Even during his announcement back in 1952, Mayor Bowern noted as much.
It should be understood that this in no way is an attempt to change the name if, as, and when spoken in the Spanish language.
So that is how we got to the current accepted anglicized pronunciation of Los Angeles. But it is important to point out that it was demographic change, specifically the influx of non-Spanish speakers, that brought about the deviation from the Spanish pronunciation to the anglicized pronunciation. It will be interesting to see if current demographic changes, specifically the growth of the Spanish-speaking population in Los Angeles, might result in a return to the Spanish pronunciation. But, as is often the case with language, if you say something wrong long enough, it eventually becomes right. Only time will tell. My name is Robert Peterson, and
All right. Well, I live in Los Feliz, so we have our own problems. So the town of the Queen of the Angels, what does that mean? For me, at least, looking at it mythologically, it means we've always been a town of the imaginary. Every town is, in some sense, a town of the imaginary because you have to imagine it to build it. But I think the phenomenon is unique in Los Angeles. After all, we began in the mind of a 16th century novelist, and the real people who followed the character in the novel recognized the place of California as California. We're a town of the symbolic. I doubt I need to explain this, but we can go back to the Tongva myth and to the Chumash myth of the landscape itself. And Carrie McWilliams has a lot of good material on this as well. That is the uniqueness of the landscape here and the symbols that give rise to it. Not to mention the symbols of the people of European descent who came because of a novel. Los Angeles and the mythological. We are a city of stories. I don't say that lightly. I can defend that quite well. We literally produce more stories than any place in the world. And I'm looking out my window now at Hollywood, the dream factory it's been called. Los Angeles is a palimpsest. A palimpsest is, I don't know if you had this as a kid, but a little cellophane, a little kind of clipboard with cellophane, and you could write on it and draw things. But if you lifted up the cellophane sheet, it was gone. That's a palimpsest. We just keep getting written over, and we write over ourselves. And I think for Robert Peterson and other historians, this is problematic. And it would be for an historian. They want to reach back through or down into the palimpsest and find the original. But I think, as an Angelino myself, I do not care to stop the stories and histories or to name something fable and falsehood, like the missionary in the story I told you. I like for the stories to keep going, because it means the stories are alive, and the more we have, the more meanings there are. Sure, there are things that are lost. There's stories that are lost. There are, in fact, peoples who are lost in this process. Landscapes are lost as well, which is why Norman Klein wrote a book about Los Angeles called The History of Forgetting. However, there seems to be something about this space that lends itself to recreation all the time. And finally, I think we're the city of angels. And I mean that in terms of what angels are. They're divine communicators. As such, they occupy a liminal space between the everyday and the sacred, and they bring messages of the sacred. I think Los Angeles might work the other way. We produce messages about the sacred. Again, not just our filmmaking history, but our history, which we keep forgetting. In fact, there may be nothing really to remember, because we still cannot decide even on what our name is or how to pronounce it. Thank you for your attention. I'll stop sharing if I can. And I didn't leave you much room for discussion. I apologize.
Okay, thank you very much for that wonderful presentation. I myself was born and raised in Los Angeles, and I probably learned more about Los Angeles history today than I did the whole time I was in school in Los Angeles Unified.
I'm so glad. Thank you.
Okay, before we go to the Q&A, there is evaluation that Fawn has put in the chat, and all you have to do is click on it. It's a QR code. You can click on the QR code and it'll come up on your phone. You can take a picture. I'm sorry, take a picture with your phone. Or I should say, just hold your phone over hold your camera over the phone and it'll come up. Okay. Okay, so in the meantime, questions. Do we have any questions or about the presentation today? That Sally? Okay, you need to unmute. Oh, wait a minute. Okay. Okay.
Try it again, Sally.
Okay, thank you.
I was just wondering about the name of the river, which I can't pronounce, where it came from.
Oh, great question. You know, that doesn't get mentioned a lot in the histories. I think it was just a local name, you know, so like only the people who lived on the river knew it. And then it gets taken up into now this Los Angeles history. I don't know. I'm sorry.
Was it Spanish or indigenous?
Well, it was Spanish, but as you know, it can be difficult to untangle these things. But I'm pretty sure it was just what the Spanish Jesuits called it, and they probably did get that from native people in the area, but we also know that Europeans tend to really mangle native words. So for example, the native tribe Anishinaabe or Ojibwe comes across in English as Chippewa. So, you know, it's just trying to understand the language and the odd syllables. Great question. I'm sorry, I don't have a better answer.
Okay. Linda?
Sorry, I was muted. I don't have a question. I just want to say thank you so very much.
Oh.
It was fascinating.
Oh, good.
Fascinating. I want to read all of the books, but I'm not sure that I will.
Thank you so much, Linda. I do apologize for taking so long.
No problem. At least not for me.
I don't think I figured in the podcast and the videos I was showing, but I'm glad you all hung in there. I appreciate it.
I have a question about it. Is related to what I said about, you know, learning the history of Los Angeles in school, because it was after, when I was in college, that I took courses myself that I became more informed. But have you ever done any research into why, you know, there isn't specifically just throughout, say, elementary, secondary education in Los Angeles, that the history is not taught? It's just, you know, we learn about the missions. There are certain things that we learn, but other than that, you know, take field trips to certain place, but there's not a lot of deep dive into the history of Los Angeles.
Yeah. Oh my goodness, Elaine, what a question. You know, it reminds me of growing up in the South, where I was taught that the Civil War was about brave men. And these are my people. And I'm like, it took me years to say, but weren't they traitors? I mean, didn't they try to separate from the nation? And I still would get that even in class when I taught in the South. It's like, well, the Civil War wasn't about slavery. It was about cotton or something. And I'm like, okay. My wife is a teacher, or was a teacher. And it was better in her school, but that was an art school. So it wasn't really LAUSD. But I think they do now, someone please tell me, because I really don't know. I think they do now try to recognize the Chumash and the Tongva in addition to the missions. I hope so. History is a tricky mythological thing. Stolen language, right?
Yeah. So in my neighborhood, every single one of the schools have recently been renamed. So I don't know if they're changing what they're teaching in the classroom.
Yeah.
But they're trying.
Oh, good. Yeah. Yeah, I was pleased. My wife was at an arts integration school in Glassell Park. And she was a dance teacher. So she was doing these Chumash and Tongva stories in relation to their California history program. So that was encouraging.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's just harder and harder to maintain those old stories, those old myths, because it's hard to keep any story alive. It really is, because everything keeps changing around it. And so you're often faced, and I mean, I don't want to stir anything up here, but you're faced with whether or not you change and how you change and how you adapt your stories, including dropping them all together, right? So renaming, right? And I think if take this for what it's worth, which is about a penny, I think fascism arises when you refuse to change your story, because you can't. That's the only way to keep the story in place, is at the point of the gun, you know, or other measures of power. But that's just me.
Makes sense.
Yeah, a lot of relevance to what we're seeing in our society today.
Exactly.
Very
Exactly.
relevant.
I mean, again, forgive me for being political, but I don't know if you remember this, but after Barack Obama won his second term, Republicans convened and they said, hey, we've got to change our story. I don't know if anybody ever remembers this, but they did what they call an autopsy on their lost election. And they said, we've got to stop demonizing people. We've got to stop, we've got to be open or change our tune on immigration. They said all these things about we've got to change our story. And then they didn't. And so we'll just leave that there.
Story didn't grow or evolve into
In fact, right, Elaine. In fact, they doubled down and tripled down on the old obsolete stories.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Does that tie into fascism?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you read On Tyranny, that little book On Tyranny, I can't think of the guy's name. Just a little book called On Tyranny. He outlines how this happens. And of course, I'm looking at it through the lens of mythology, so I see what's happening. Myth is stolen language. What you need to do is steal some new language, create a new reality, which will create a new world.
Very
dear.
Interesting. Very interesting. Any more questions or comments? Okay.
Sally, there's a bird about to attack you. I don't know if you know that, but
Yeah, I have these giant birds at my house. I have a hummingbird too that's also very scary.
It's her constant companion.
Okay. Fawn, did you have anything to add or any announcements about anything?
Thank you very much for coming, and I hope that we can get you again. I'm going to beg you until I we can figure it out. And no, this is so interesting. I've never knew most of this. So thank you very, very much. And yeah, we'd love to have you back.
Thank you, Fawn.
And you need to get rid of that cough. You get yourself.
I know, right? I'm not speaking. I'm not doing public speaking anymore. So my voice is like, what are you doing?
See, this was good for you.
It was.
It saved your voice. Yes.
Fawn and Linda are a great tag team. I didn't really want to do this. I mean, I was just busy.
We weren't gonna take no.
Yeah,
Where else can you teach in bed?
pretty awesome.
Yeah, that was very, very informative.
Thank you.
Yeah,
it was wonderful.
Yeah.
Very informative.
Very good.
Very good. New way of thinking.